What made you write the book?
Right. So in brief, my background's strategy. And when I was younger, I used to think that being right was enough. And the culture stuff, I kind of dismissed it. I thought it's soft. And then the older you get, you realize the so-called soft stuff is really, really hard. And when it's strong, if you have a strong culture, reasonable strategy, you'll probably be fine. Brilliant strategy, lousy culture, good luck. But I thought that a lot of the literature on culture did a good job defining the problem, but wasn't necessarily a great solution. So the classical virtues have been around for thousands of years. Perhaps there's a reason for that. That's where I got interested. The virtues were a good vehicle to strengthen a culture.
Great. For those who have not read the book, and I told Peter I was going to sell some books today, would you talk a little bit about, naming those virtues and the interplay between the virtues and changing culture, or directing culture?
So it does start with a common language. I mean, you won't get anybody to kind of push back on cultures more powerful than strategy, which doesn't dismiss the importance of strategy, but it's pretty vague. So what does that look like? You need a common language. And that's the benefit of these 7 classical virtues. So I can hit these really quickly. We can't remember paragraphs, but we can remember a catchphrase. So for trust is efficient. When teams trust each other, they move really quick. They're going to save you a lot of money. For compassion, service before self, which actually makes you tougher the more other focused you are than compared to how self-absorbed we might be. Courage is doing the hard right rather than the easy wrong. Courage issues don't tend to be complicated, but they come with risk. And justice is by far the most complicated virtue because there's not an objective standard. So because the world's so nuts, how do I live by conviction and not have circumstances define who I become is quite a challenge. And wisdom is striving to understand rather than be understood. And temperance is calm is contagious, and hope is about being better and not bitter.
Great. Let's unpack compassion a little bit. We talked a little bit before this started about vulnerability and how my workforce, I have 350 to 400 employees. Many of them are frontline workers. Many come from what you could call tough neighborhoods or tough circumstances. So it's perhaps counterintuitive to be vulnerable in the workplace. Could you unpack that? We talked a little bit about what that means and how that can show up, and how as employers we might be able to help shape that, and tactics to help shape that.
Yeah, you use the right word. It's counterintuitive. Compassion could sound like a weak word rather than a tough word. When you unpack compassion, it means to suffer with. So there's nothing weak about that. And as more other focused I am, it makes me tougher. So if we go back to your question about vulnerability and courage, can anyone come up with an example where somebody's been courageous and they weren't vulnerable? So the paradox is it's the soft stuff that makes us hard and tough. And the absence of it actually makes us more fragile.
Thank you. So I gave you an example of, I've been trying to get free advice from Peter to try to
maybe worth what you're paying for.
Right. To try to implement some of the virtues, or some of the intentional virtue training, I would say, into my workplace. When you look at the virtues, where would you start in terms of trying to redirect this hard-shelled employee who is, working with a team or serving customers? Of those virtues, where would you start?
Right. There's a lot. That's a really good question. To some of the threads to it, it's going to be awful hard to get movement without motivation. So trying to understand what motivates people is a pretty good start. Adopting the common language is a big deal. This is just one example. It's a very simple exercise. If you put those catchphrases up on a screen, no explanation of what the virtues are, and you simply say, tell me a story when the presence or absence of these virtues impacted performance. With no background at all, people very quickly come up with positive or negative stories, which is what Aristotle said 2,500 years ago. These virtues are already in us. The question is, can they be cultivated? So it's less about, do I know this stuff? The hard part is, can I do this stuff?
And that's what we find. It's implementing, it's the how,
Right.
not if. You tell a story in your book of meeting two people, two very different people who faced adversity, and they were the catalyst. Could you share that with us, the catalyst for writing the book?
Yeah, I think the part that's always kind of intrigued me is, how do you practice these virtues with people who don't plan to return the favor? And I'm in awe of the two people you're describing. Of one gentleman was incarcerated unfairly for nearly 30 years on death row, and a woman who I had a chance to have lunch with. She'll never remember me, and I'm never going to forget her. She was a Holocaust survivor, and that was just kind of the beginning of her trouble. She had a tough life, but yet both were approached life with grace and grit. So I don't want their problems, but I want to learn from them. Let's assume that life isn't always going to go grand. And then how will I kind of reset myself when, not if, trouble hits? And I was intrigued with what both of their stories were. And neither of their stories are kind of a quick fix where suddenly everything's all settled. I think in some ways, for both of them, what I took away from them is they're healed, but not necessarily cured. There's still, it's like a scab that's still there. And you can see that they struggled at times, but they got to a place of wisdom. And that's what I saw in the pattern of them: is there's suffering, then there's wisdom, then there's service. And I'm intrigued with people who are able to pull that off. Not that I can do it, but I'm intrigued what I could learn from them.
Yeah, I had a friend who was going through, had suffered a loss, and said, I'm broken, but I'm not shattered.
Yeah, there you go.
So as long as you're not shattered, you can put the pieces back together, right? And move forward with grace. And that's something that phrase, I try to live by. It might be broken for a while, but not shattered. And with you also talk about resilience and post-traumatic stress, where we use the term toxic stress a lot, but it's not toxic if you have a support system.
Right, exactly.
And that's where the compassion and empathy of others, where we can lift up and surround that person, and it enables them to be resilient and to move forward. So great. So I heard you say language is important, and I believe that language is important. We talked a little bit about engagement, employee engagement, and you had some great takeaways in terms of, again, what leaders can do and what frontline workers can do. And what I found great about your book, it's the takeaways transcend industry, transcend demographics. I see one of my friends who is a managing partner at a firm in town. She could, implement this at her firm. I can implement this in my business, which is fast food. And so would you talk a little bit about those engagement, why engagement is important, the statistics on engagement, and how it impacts our performance and how it impacts our bottom line?
So, there's decades of research that shows that high levels of engagement will get all the other things that you want: better returns in financial sense, better margins, retention rates of teams, customers. It goes on and on and on. So from an academic point of view, that's been put to rest, that's kind of the key piece. But I'm not sure that
it's the how that's difficult. That's what I want you to talk about.
Exactly.
We know the other, but it's the how.
It's the how is the hard part. And the math is bleak in that 20 years of research from Gallup, sample size 1.5 million, 50 countries. And for 20 years, the needle hasn't moved. That 70% of people are reporting they're not engaged with their position. So that's a lousy investment. So the obvious question is, well, how do you kind of turn that around? And what the research is really clear about is that engagement is largely about pro-social behavior. And the best pro-social technology ever invented is virtue. So can I get you to work harder because I pay you more? And the answer is, the best it's a sugar high. There's actually research that shows you may become demotivated. I don't want to be misunderstood. We got to pay people fairly, and job satisfaction is not going to pay my mortgage. But if I can get you to work harder, if the richest companies in the world could just pay people off, then they do it. So if you break it back down, it's all right. Well, what leads to higher levels of engagement? Engagement being defined by discretionary effort. I look around, I see what needs to be done. Who do I need to work with? And I own it. And you can kind of lump it into, do I belong? Do I matter? Do I make a difference? And those three big pillars, the foundation of that's going to be the presence or absence of virtue.
Now, we know that DEI in some places has come under attack. Talk to me a little bit about DEI and virtue and how they're integrated. I'm putting words in your mouth, but how they're integrated.
No,
I don't know how you can be virtuous without being inclusive and diverse.
That's right. So this is an interesting body of research on, is implicit bias, is that real? The answer is yes. So, all right, well, if I train you not to be biased, can I cure you of it? The answer is no. All right, then how do I do it? And so what's the research show? And part of it is the way our brains are functioning. We drop people into us and them, and that's part of being human. That's the bad news. The good news is we can increase the number of people we put in the us category. But the key is we got to get to know each other's story. So there's research behind this. I'll just be very brief about it. There's a guy named Gordon Allport in 1954, I think, wrote a book about prejudice. And he looked at, after World War II, that the mess we got ourselves in had an awful lot to do with prejudice. So his question was, all right, if you pull people together who are different, does that increase prejudice or does it decrease prejudice? And now there's the meta-analysis studies, literally hundreds and hundreds of studies. I'm being brief about this. When we get to know each other's stories, the prejudice starts to melt away. If I don't know your story, then all the stereotypes start to kick in. I'm not saying that's easy to do, but I don't know how else you can get at it. Then we got to get to know each other's stories. And then I start to see, I'll give one concrete example of this, of if teams spend some time responding to their 4 H's. So what's your history? Who are your heroes? What have been your heartbreaks? And what are your hopes? And if you and I go through that exercise, we're likely to find how we're more similar than dissimilar. And it's just a tactic to get to know each other's story.
Sure. So that is just part of what Dr. Plummer has been doing, and I participated with her group of getting to know one another, Black women and white women in a social context. And it's hard. Right. It's hard work. There's vulnerability. Yep. But it also, you start to see really understanding how we are more similar than like. But in the workplace, right now we're very polarized country. I'm sure some employers don't even want the employees to really, move past superficial chit chat. How do you manage that? How do you help navigate that as someone who's trying to put virtue and use virtue in the workplace?
Yeah. You said something that's important, is vulnerability is the front door to trust, and trust is key for performance. So there's not kind of an alternative to trust other than vulnerability. So what we're really debating then is, what does that look like for a team? Those 4 H's are just one tactic. There's a bunch of others that could be done. But as you were describing white and Black women coming together, there's a vulnerability to that. But once people get to know each other's stories, we start to break down some of the barriers, and it gets interesting. I mean, it doesn't have to be.
Oh no, it does.
It's really interesting. So it's part of it is a mindset, is to be curious, replace judgment with curiosity. I wonder how this person got this way. I wonder what their background has been. And some of it will be the same as mine, and some of it will be different.
That's right. Yeah, I was just talking with someone just the other day, was saying you're not necessarily going to change a mind, but you can start to understand their position, why they believe what they believe.
Exactly.
And there may be some commonality, at least in that not that belief, but that process.
That's right.
To say, okay, I can empathize, still disagree, but I can understand, why you are the way you are and how
That's
you
right.
got there.
There's an example of that the FBI looks at this kind of research. So you're negotiating with a terrorist. There's a lot at stake here. How the heck are you going to get it done? And they'll rely on empathy, questions, listening. So until I feel heard and understood, good luck getting me to change. I still may not change, even after I feel heard and understood. But minus that, I'm not sure how we make any progress.
Sure. We talked a little bit about what COVID has done to all of us, and some were isolated. We're coming out of it, but I shared with you, I'm seeing behaviors in staff as well as, frankly, customers that I'd never seen in 10 years. And you had some suggestions maybe of how we start to address that in the workplace.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I heard this description of COVID we all had the same pandemic, but boy, was it a different experience. If you thought about it as some of us were on an ocean liner, we had all of our food, we were getting our paychecks, all was good. Some people are out in a dinghy, kind of struggling with the waves, and some people are hanging onto a driftwood. So we didn't really have the same experience, but the isolation, we lost some of our relationship skills. And we're going to have to build those muscles back up. We don't have common sense would tell you this. And you look at all the polls, the level of sense of grievance across all of the population is not where we want it to be. So we're going to have to dial that back and learn to kind of slay our egos a little bit. I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I think it's going to be hard, but the degree to which I can become other focused, I'll find my life is richer. It's going to be ultimately in my self-interest to do it. And the more self-absorbed I am, the more fragile I am, and life's going to be a lot rougher.
All right. And I found the book, it was the book was helpful, I think, from an employer standpoint, but also from an individual. And could you talk about just, we talked about the virtues, but how some of the ways we as individuals can employ, those virtues in our family lives, in our social interactions outside of work.
So I'll give one. There's a lot of written on character education for kids. So there's these interesting studies where we'll ask parents, okay, you got to choose. Do you want a kid of character? You want a high achiever? These are global studies. And 85 to 90% of parents will say, I'm going to go with the kid of character. Then you ask the kids, what do your parents want? Do they want you to be a kid of character, high achiever?
They want you to make A's, right?
Exactly. 85, 90% of the kids are saying achievement.
That's the message that they're receiving.
Exactly. And of course, that's not what the parents intend. But I think the challenge is it's easier for us to talk about how's school going, what are your grades, athletics, music, whatever the interest is. So if we flipped it a bit and say, how do we get across what we really care about? The message to the kid, you can try this out at a family dinner. Look, that unconditional love stuff, you're good. There's nothing you have to do to earn it. You're not going to lose it. And by the way, the point of school is not to come back as the starting quarterback, first chair violinist, valedictorian. That's not the point of school. Your job is to ask 3 questions every day. Were you brave? Were you kind? Did you learn from your mistakes? And a 6-year-old girl will know about bravery. She's already got it in her. So what you're trying to do is pull it out. You'll get an eye roll when you first try it, but you compare that to, what did you learn in school today? Nothing. What did you do today? Nothing. And it's an intriguing question that starts to pull people in. Then sooner or later, the kid will ask the parent, so what did you do today to be brave? But you're changing the conversation to focus on the practice of virtue, the practice of character, rather than limiting it to the achievement part. And there's a paradox. When the kid focuses on what they can control, bravery, kindness, learning from mistakes, performance goes up. When the kid is focused on stuff they can't control, being the valedictorian, anxiety goes up, performance declines. So there's a mercenary benefit to doing this, but the leading dog needs to be the character stuff.
That's right. Okay. So parents out there, we've got 3 questions to ask your children tonight. I've been asking the questions, and we said this wasn't going to be an interview. So I'd like to talk a little bit about or have you, we'll share, before we started, we talked about what we're seeing in COVID, and you had what I thought it was a novel tactic with grievance, and how we could employ this in our own, when you're upset and angry and, the whole world is against me,
Right.
the questions that you could ask of yourself, of your family members, of your employees.
Right.
We're not sure, guys, that this is going to work, but it's worth a try.
Right,
If all else fails.
It could fall flat. So the question you can pose is, tell me your most cherished grudge. So on a 1 to 10 scale, I'm not looking for a 1 to 3 carrots grudge. Something that my car got scratched in the parking lot. I mean, a beauty. It's a 6, and maybe I could drive it up to an 8. And by grudge, I mean it's a resentment. I got something I didn't want, or I didn't get something I did want. And so there's an evidence-based way you can improve the quality of your grudge. And you start out by taking things as personal as possible. That's going to help. Have lots of unenforceable laws. So just like when you're driving through traffic, people are defying the law of physics. You want to kind of call them out, but there's nothing you can do about it. But by far, the best way to improve the quality of your grudge is create a victim story that the world's out to get me, and ask the question, why me, a lot. That'll help. And you can take that 6 or 7 carat grudge, drive it right up to about an 8, and it's sitting right there on your shoulder whenever you want it. Now, if you want to flip it and say, okay, I've got this 7 carat grudge, could I get it down to a 4? Maybe I can't get it to 0. You flip the question by saying, all right, how do I take things less personally? Could I think about forgiveness as a skill, not so the other person can sleep well at night, but so I can sleep better at night? And then there's really good evidence. This is all evidence-based. This comes from Stanford University, that has a forgiveness institute. Realistic optimism is a big deal. So reality is, these are the boundary conditions I cannot change. Now, inside those boundary conditions is optimism. A growth mentality. How am I going to grow from this? And this is my last part of, when I started at Parker, if you would have asked me, what do I see has a big impact on resilience and performance? I promise my answer was not gratitude. I'm not against gratitude. I just thought that just sounds kind of mushy. And then when you looked at the research, it was really compelling of how much that gratitude did have an impact on resilience, on teamwork, on collaboration. So what's gratitude? I'm focusing on what I have versus what I don't have. And it's an old as dirt model. I mean, the root word of gratitude is grace, or a gift that I haven't gotten. What's new is the social science research. So I'll just say these briefly. The original study, people wrote down 3 things that ticked them off for 21 days. The second group wrote down 3 things they were grateful for 21 days. And the control group, no difference. And the outcome was the grateful group, more grateful day 22 than day 0. The miserable group, more miserable day 22 and day 0. And the control group, no difference. And all that is a backdrop to say the way we approach life is about habits. I can acquire a habit of being an ingrate, or I can acquire a habit of being more grateful. I'm never going to be perfect at it, but the more I can kind of move it in that direction, the paradox is the soft stuff makes me tougher.
Right. And I think many of us have seen that in our lives. You see the people who are always miserable, and they're always miserable, right?
Right.
And you see
they
people
excel at it.
and they excel at it, and life is tough, and it becomes tougher because they're miserable. It's a vicious cycle. And those who, one thing I'm doing intentionally is I say, I want people who will bring me joy in my life. And so I am grateful for them. And the more gratitude I feel and show, the more grateful I am. And life is just happier, right? There's just more joy. The empathy is also one of the virtues that I think people struggle with, putting themselves in someone else's shoes. Could you talk a little bit about the research you've done and some of the takeaways from your book?
Yes, you can kind of think of empathy as the front door to compassion. So all these virtues are on a spectrum. Over here is ruthlessness. Here is pity. I feel badly for you, but I'm not planning to do anything about it. I'm glad it's you and it's not me. And empathy, I'm going to at least try to struggle to understand where you're coming from. And that's a foundational piece. But compassion, the standard's higher. The idea of how do I relieve someone's suffering? It's going to cost me something. I can't be just listen. I've got to look for ways to be constructive and try to determine what is the best way I can be useful here. That all these virtues are on a spectrum, and none of us are going to do this correctly. There's Rumi's a 13th century Sufi poet. I'm taking a lot of poetic license with this, but I think his description was, if I practice virtue, I'm sure I'm going to become an angel, but I might become less of a jackass.
There you go. Better humans, right?
Better human.
And better performance. I want to go back to D&I a bit as we apply all of these virtues through that lens. Mm-hmm. For employers, for counselors, for those engaged in DEI work, on the spectrum, where do the virtues play in that on the spectrum? Mm-hmm. You just talked about a spectrum. Right. So if we want to start, we're starting because you noted that we've learned through behavioral studies that inclusion actually should be the start, not diversity. And I will admit, I've always in the past said, well, you do need inclusion, right? Because if it has to be a welcoming and a belonging place, but if you have inclusion and you're only including a homogeneous population, what are we doing, right? So I don't disagree, but I'm pushing back a little bit at we have to do both. Right. But that's my opinion. But what does the research say? So
I think there's it's a big complicated question, and I'm not suggesting I've got all the answers to this at all. Here's what I do find interesting about the virtues. They unite people. I mean, who doesn't want to be on a team where people trust each other, they're compassionate, they're fair, and they're hopeful? And who the heck wants to be on a team where people are ruthless, they're a bunch of cowards, and they're full of despair? So I think that helps on both the inclusion and the diversity, is find our common ground. We're independent of all of our differences. How can we be against any of these ideas? Now, the challenge is living up to the aspirations. Right. Fair enough.
Because we talked about bias or unconscious bias. Right. Let me push you a little more. So we have leaders are going to have to make a decision in this moment where we've made so much progress. We're headed to a multicultural country, right. But there are some headwinds, right? Lawsuits, liability. Right. So what do you say to those leaders trying to make those decisions right now, where it might be easier
to put your head down,
and just wait to see what happens?
Yeah. I mean,
in the virtue lens, with the virtue lens,
exactly, because it implicates justice and wisdom, doesn't right?
That's right.
You still want to be committed to a just society. I don't think you want to let go of that. It's the debatable part is more the how, because the environment changed a lot over the last couple of years. So you have an extreme position, maybe cancel culture on the one hand, wokeism on the other hand. I believe most people really do want to look for a way to create an inclusive, diverse, either a workforce or school. So we're back to the how problem. Mm-hmm. But it's not a bad beginning place to say, how do we make everybody feel included? What does that start to look like for everyone? How do we make sure we're hearing everybody's voice, knowing each other's stories? Vanessa, I don't know how else to begin than at least start there. And then we can kind of back into when we're doing interviewing, do we have a diverse pool? When we look at who's getting hired, who's getting promoted. I mean, those are all really important issues. It's how do we start to kind of build a little bit of similarity and unity?
And you named some of the, best practices, good practices. Where have you seen this? Where have you seen living the virtues and diversity really work? What are some examples at corporations, maybe?
It's probably implied rather than explicit. So I do think there's an opportunity
to be a little more explicit.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree.
So I think when you see it happening, meaning it's a reasonable person could look at that company and say, they really are inclusive, they really are diverse. And then if we backed out of it, I can't imagine that those goals would be achieved without the virtues.
Right.
So I think the opportunity is just what you said. Could we make it more explicit rather than implied? You know, every generation seems to have to learn these virtues. That wouldn't be a bad place to begin. Of when we got this right, what do we do? Which virtues were present? How do we replicate that?
Right. I'm looking at the chat. I see there's some questions coming through. Is there a link to the Forgiveness Institute he mentioned? Someone shared the link to the Forgiveness Institute. So implicit is I think they'd like to hear a little bit more about the Forgiveness Institute and the findings and how you implement forgiveness.
So that particular institute just kind of makes an argument that grievance just isn't an effective way to deal with our problems or our relationships. And they go a level deeper of what happens to us with our immune system when we all get hosed up. I mean, it has this 3-pound piece of meat on top of my shoulders is not separate from my body. So what I think actually hits me at the metabolic level. And there's 2 studies that fascinate the heck out of me. That when you and I trust and care about each other, it's metabolically inexpensive. So what's metabolism? It's glucose, it's salt, it's oxygen. And the brain is always trying to figure out, predict, and regulate. And so if it looks like it's a safe environment, I'm not having to put a lot of resources into trying to deal with a distrustful relationship. The second study is they treat one group of people terribly, stuff them into an MRI machine. The other group, we treat them nicely, we stuff them into an MRI machine. And the lizard brain, the amygdala, literally shrinks when trust and compassion are present. So it's not woo-woo stuff. Right, there's science behind this.
And I have 2 more questions in the chat. For you, again, in the book, you talked about we talked about respect and this trigger of I've been disrespected. Right. And you explain that to the person who feels they've been disrespected, the brain is signaling danger, right?
Exactly.
So that helped me understand why. I'm like, why are you so upset? Mm-hmm. We're selling chicken and biscuits, right? But if the customer disrespects them, it becomes something. So it is actually a real neurological issue.
You've learned to predict trouble. So based on your experiences that this looks like another fight or I got to flee. Right. And the bad news is that stuff sticks with us. This isn't a quick fix. But the good news is you can learn different behavior. You can, neuroplasticity is a wonderful word. I can change the way my brain is wired from the time I'm born to the time I die.
But it can change through behavior. So we've got a couple of interesting questions. Well, one person wants you to repeat the key definitions for each of the virtues. They're taking notes.
Trust is efficient. For compassion, service before self. For courage, do the hard right rather than the easy wrong. For justice, live by conviction, not circumstance. For wisdom, strive to understand rather than be understood. For temperance, calm is contagious. And for hope, to be better, not bitter.
Excellent. And if you buy the book, he goes into great detail. Another question, how do companies make the virtues more explicit without appearing to be religious evangelizing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, Parker's, we're in 50 countries. It's got to be secular and it can't be US centric. Those 7 virtues I walk through are known as the 7 classical virtues. Classical means they cut across time, they cut across borders. So that's once a month, I spend time with our Asian Pacific team. I'm the only American on the call. Oh, okay. And we're talking about how do you integrate the virtues into operations. That's what I find endlessly fascinating is this Aristotle guy and Confucius were pretty smart. And I think I can make a case these virtues go back 10,000 years. So once humans came together, they had to figure out how to get along. And the virtues were the best we have to offer.
Excellent. Another question. In keeping with asking why, what was the catalyst for you to examine this so thoroughly? So we know you had a meeting with 2 people, but this is frankly, a body of work a journey that you've been on for years and years. So
Right.
what made you think, I want to keep doing this?
Because I think there's a human hunger to make sense of our life. And part of that is, well, who do I want to be? And unless you're Aristotle, it's hard to answer that question. So if you start with what we've kind of known has always worked well, that's really intriguing to me. It's intriguing to me that it cuts across borders and time and generations and race. That's fascinating to me. And it's hard. I mean, what's fascinating about it, it's really easy to understand and bloody hard to do.
Bloody hard to implement. Tell me about it. Okay. Um, how do you use the virtues to eradicate the isms when others deny others' stories as false?
That's a good question. I wouldn't claim victory on any of that. What I can say is when you start to get the virtues going as a conversation among people that are all over the map, every way you want to measure that, it does bring people together in part because what's to be against? And then it shifts into what you've been raising of how are we actually going to do this? So I expected more pushback when I first started doing this decades ago. That's another part of this puzzle that's interesting to me is you just don't get blowback on this. Because I think again, I don't think there's
well, it starts with the word virtue.
Who's against
it? Who's against virtue?
Exactly. I think it's more the tougher nut is dealing with the cynic or a person with a big ego or is arrogant, who's narcissistic. Those are the tough nuts. That's the tougher part to take on.
Right. And so I'm pushing a little more of the isms, let's say sexism, racism, disabled.
Right.
Where do you start? Because I know you have some suggested conversations. So where would you start with those really tough isms?
I'm probably repeat myself a bit, but let me kind of offer this and then kind of back into back to the story part. I think our enemy is narcissism, arrogance, being self-absorbed, judgment, no curiosity. Those are tough hills to climb. I'm not suggesting any of that is easy. So we're back to, so what do we know from the evidence? What would lead somebody to be a little more open-minded? And it does start with, do I feel heard? Do I feel understood? Will that open up the door on kind of dealing with whatever ism we're discussing? It's a start. Is it going to be able to claim victory? I doubt it, but it's a start. I don't know where else to start.
Right. Yeah. So again, I think this is where courage comes in, right? To have these conversations and to have leaders in the workplace to allow these conversations.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I guess that's where hope comes in, right? The hope, the realistic optimism, hoping that there are leaders who, and I know there are leaders who still will not just allow but promote these conversations, and there's still people doing unconscious bias training, having authentic conversations. So I am.
You're hopeful.
I'm hopeful. I am.
We
have to remain. We have to remain hopeful.
I am too.
Otherwise, And
I think that just a piece of this that one of the things I love about Parker is it's global. So it's very rare I'm in a meeting with only Americans. So it's another form of diversity, but that's the part that's really cool.
Right. You're global.
You learn a lot.
You do. So can you drill down more on how, and I think it's a good question. Can you drill down more on how the virtues amplify performance and how to build a case for it in an organization so they spend more time and resources in helping employees develop the virtues?
Yeah,
this is pretty much his entire book.
That's right.
so you can start with but there is a business case, right?
Yeah,
There's a business case. So could you talk a little more about your findings and the findings of others that show increased performance, increased profitability, efficiency, and how those tie?
So I'll just a couple concepts, then I'll give some data. The word virtue means excellence. So it doesn't take much imagination once we know that it drives higher levels of performance. And when you invert each of the virtues, it becomes pretty easy to see, boy, does that muck up performance. Distrust. Nobody cares about each other. Cowardice, injustice. We lack wisdom and we're blowing off steam all the time and we're full of despair. What team could possibly compete based on those qualities? So now if I go the other direction, I've run a bunch of experimental design studies where you have a control group. The trouble with PhD means permanent head damage, that you look at the world in terms of pre-post control treatment randomization. So when I think the key for the business case, I don't think the virtues are a quick fix, just to be really clear. But we've run tests, control group and a treatment group. Over a course of about 12 months, we see jumps in engagement by 10 to 20%. So it's a pretty big effect. So if your dependent variable was engagement as a way to make the business case, it's there. I get a little leery about making claims for financial returns. I think there's a relationship there, but there's an awful lot that goes into financial returns. I think it's a straighter line for engagement. So if you had a leader, to kind of answer the question more directly, that really was genuinely interested in how do I improve engagement? And we understand that it's about pro-social behavior. And we understand that the best we got is virtue. Then it becomes a how problem. Mm-hmm. What would it look like to practice that?
Mm-hmm. With engagement, just asking the question, is there a correlation? I'm assuming, but I shouldn't assume, you're a scientist, a correlation between turnover and engagement. Can we make that? Is then that would lead to a clear, at least some financial benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So why do people leave their jobs? 70% of the time they leave their boss, they don't leave the company. So what it implicates is frontline leadership. Typically, this is a general guideline, 70% of the variance in engagement scores is the direct leader. And roughly speaking, 70% of the people that work for an organization report to a frontline leader. That's a group that tends to get ignored. And they come to work every day and want to do a good job, but they don't know how to kind of create a team or how to function well with a team. That by far is the best, sadly, the best predictor of somebody leaving the organization.
And perhaps the best investment would be professional development for those frontline leaders. Note to self. No, we're working. I told you about our consultant. When I first took over the business, I hired a consultant to come in and do professional development. Didn't go over.
It didn't go well.
I think the consultant went out screaming. No. But a great group of people. We talked about this. You're a product of your experiences.
Right.
And so if you've had really, really tough experiences, it's going to take a little more love.
Exactly.
And you have to understand that.
Yeah, it's not without reason. If all my relationships are founded on distrust and I seem to be getting into squabbles wherever I go, that's not a quick fix. If suddenly, I'm okay, we'll do hugs and kisses from here on in. That's just not going to happen.
Right. I was telling Peter, at least in my world, you have to do both. We've got to talk about the metrics, and we're focused on the metrics while otherwise I'd go out of business while we're working on culture, and we'll continue to do so. How can we weave the virtues in hiring practices and hire for virtue as well as needed skill sets?
It's a great question. So here's the framing you could consider: hire for character, train for competence. So think about a 2x2 box. Somebody's got high competence and high character, should drive them to work every day, polish their shoes. This is the star. Yes. And if they lack both, they lack character, they lack competence, that's a selection error. So the story's going to end. That's the only debate. I think the trickier parts are high competence, low character. That's your culture killer, because they're really smart, they're cunning, they're clever. You wish they were dumb and lazy, and you could see it coming.
Right, and they're poison because they're spreading
they're killing you.
Yeah.
And then the other box is, let's say, threshold competence, because you do need to know what you're doing, but high character. And by definition, a person of high character is not going to be happy staying that way. If you cut to the chase, you can learn a lot about a culture by asking two questions. Does the person with high competence and low character get a pass? Does the person with threshold competence and high character get a chance?
All right. So we are the company of second chances. We get plenty of chances. Oh, no, this was just a comment. The word virtue means excellent, excellence. Who knew? So that's.
And it's not a virtue until I act. So talking about this with a wonderful person to a nice audience, I get 0 points.
That's right.
The question is when things go sideways, and they will always go sideways, how do I show up? There's a interesting description of what's the purpose of a leader. And this is an answer that came from a school in England in 1930, that you're adequate at a dance and invaluable at a shipwreck.
Oh, yeah.
If we had more people that were invaluable in a
shipwreck, right? Who's really in there leading? Okay. Well, I'm gonna. Well, I know you can't tell the whole story, but you have to, going back to how we have to understand where our employees are in their life's journey, or someone, if not the CEO, the frontline leader, someone has to engage and really. You mentioned in the book, one of the most powerful tools is just sitting down and getting to know your employees,
Right.
or getting to know your coworkers,
Right.
which is something we probably don't do enough anymore because
Right.
we're afraid to engage. But could you talk a little bit about that engagement and just what that means, what your research has shown? Just simple acts of building a relationship.
I mean, there's a whole body of research. This is one way of answering your question on psychological safety, which sounds like kind of a wimpy word, but the science on this is rock solid. So there are 3 behaviors that create psychological safety: vulnerability, questions, and learning. And there's 3 behaviors that crush it: blame, humiliation, and ignore. I hope we don't humiliate people. Blame's a good sport. The ignore is kind of the tough nut, because the leader's got a to-do list that's this long and has this much time to do it. Doesn't mean anything by it. They're going from their office to get a cup of coffee, but the person feels slighted.
Right.
And it drops their level of engagement. Now, to put a little firmer edge on psychological safety, the goal is not psychological safety. The goal is motivation and accountability for results. And the goal is not comfort. The goal is candor. And it's exceedingly rare. But boy, when you get it, it deals with all the uncertainty. And I mean, how can you get things done unless people will put up their hand and say, I see trouble here, or I see opportunity here, versus I think if I put my hand up, I'm going to get it chopped off.
Or we need to correct this. We
exactly.
Need to fix it. Right. Okay. This is from Lisa. Yes, since conflict is to be expected whenever humans are involved, what skills do we build for the shipwreck days, especially when things feel out of control? For sure, I hope we're striving to minimize avoidable shipwrecks.
So one story on the shipwrecks, and then one that's a tool. There's actually a study that was looked at 300 shipwrecks. And the question was, what was the likelihood the sailor would live or die? And they could look at journals. So how did they describe what it was like? And when things like compassion and trust were present, high probability the sailors were going to live. And if it was ruthlessness, every person for themselves, high probability they were going to die. So kind of understanding that, I think, is at least a place to get us directionally solid. The piece that we were talking about before as a skill is, how do we de-escalate a conflict? What's the evidence on that? What we want is to get to a good outcome and not destroy the relationship. That's what we're hoping for. And so I'm going to go over this really quickly. You think about courage as a skill. All these virtues are skills, which means they can be learned. This is just one tool where, when I'm finding that I'm disconnected with the other person, I start with a question. Is there a reason why we're doing this? I don't say anything bad about your mother or call you out. And I'm hoping the question might get it done. If that doesn't work, the second level is, can we get some help here so we can find a good outcome? That doesn't work. Some version of good, bad, good. And we always want to do the right thing. If we go down that path, I'm a little worried. Here's where we want to end up. What the evidence shows is that scripting those three pieces, one of those is likely to work. But if it doesn't, okay, plan step 4. Anything I can do to change your mind? That's my Hail Mary pass.
When all else fails. Right.
And the last one is some kind of an if then. If you're going to do this, then I'm going to do that. So that's when I'm kind of taking it to the wall. But even there, it can be difficult, right? It could be, I really need this job and I can't afford to lose it. So maybe I can't I can't take it right to the wall. Right. But that's an evidence-based way to de-escalate a conflict. And this is true of all these virtues. Your question reminds me of this. West Point did a study, dependent variable job performance, academic performance, 100 years of research. How much of performance can be explained by their language was non-cognitive skills, things like virtue, and versus cognitive skills, things like intelligence. 25% of the variance, cognitive skills, intelligence, 75% of the variance, non-cognitive. Okay. It's this is the huge performance amplifier that's sitting right in front of us. Right. That's the gap. That's the gap. This is West Point. They wouldn't do it to be warm and fuzzy. They're doing it because they want to perform high.
Yeah. But when I read that, I said, "Well, there's hope. No,
there's hope.
there's hope. It's as much will or more will than skill. And you can usually teach. I say, if you give me an average cognitive ability, we can teach the skill. It's the will.
That's right.
But going back to hiring for a minute, you talked about this, but it is difficult to see that will, that
it is
early on, you know.
And you do this a ton of time. You know, the interviewing is just kind of the lousiest way of all.
It is a horrible way to hire.
It is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you back, this is more interviewing, what seems to work, which doesn't mean it's going to work. You're always going to make mistakes. Let's start with that premise. But we know that if we have standard questions, have a diverse team, but a standard set of questions that we're all looking at and interpreting, that helps some of the variance.
Right.
Asking questions about adversity. You know, what was the toughest thing you went through? How'd you handle it? And the one that I think doesn't get used enough is reference checks. So that, you know, they give me 3. Well, we're going to talk to people that you didn't give us.
That's right.
This is taking it to a level that's not realistic for a lot of jobs, but this was done for a senior leader. They looked at like 30 reference checks. Said, what we want to know is who's the person that you got sideways with and how did you deal with that? And we want to call that person and see what their take is on things. That reduces a lot of the variance.
And I find if you ask the right questions, and everyone's concerned about liability, but in my experience, we're wrapping it up. Yeah. In my experience, people will tell you the truth.
Yeah, I think that's
we've had people, off the record, run, that sort of thing. So well, you know what? It is the appointed time. This has been a pleasure,
Same here,
Peter, talking with you. And the book, someone asked for the name of the book. It is Better Humans, Better Performance. And it is sold where books are sold, online at bookstores. And it's been a true pleasure. Someone says this is the same research U of C has done with high schoolers. Oh, thank you. That's in the chat. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Peter and Vanessa. What a great conversation. It had so many gems in there, gems that are things that you can put right into practice, for a huge impact. Some of them, it seems like it would be easy to do, but, others, it's really hard to practice those virtues. I was writing my whole list of those gems, and I'm sure you have yours too. Suffering leads to wisdom, to service. As long as you're not shattered, you can move forward. If you don't know your story, then bias increases. No, alternative to trust is vulnerability. You can empathize and can still disagree. Replace judgment with curiosity. What we saw in the chat, a lot of them, were you brave? Were you kind? Did you learn from your mistakes? I think those are questions we should ask every adult and ask ourselves, not just kids. I mean, I think that is a lifelong learning. Gratitude, focusing on what you have and not what you don't have, making the virtues more integrated, competence and character for hiring, it's not a virtue until you act. It goes on and on. So what, a very rich and conversation. And I do encourage everybody to get the book so that you can have all of that, those nuggets in the place, and also the research and the gems behind it. We are very grateful to you, Peter Ria, and to Vanessa Whiting. What a great conversation, and for your contribution as business leaders and community leaders as well. Our goal at Getting to We is to sponsor these kind of learning experiences like this series and bring more learning resources to the widest audience possible. And how do we turn us and them into we, especially in these times, and also to do it for across all socioeconomic classes. So in order to do that, we need your support. And you can support by making a tax-deductible donation. The website is on the thing. You can just go right there. And we are excited for any amount, and truly mean that. We get excited for $20, we get excited for $200, we get excited for $20,000. We do our happy dance. So if you can, please do give to according to your means. And be sure to sign up for our newsletter if you're not on that, but also spread it to your network. That helps. So again, many, many thanks to Peter and Vanessa for a great conversation and sharing with us your wisdom. And to all of you, thank you for joining, because we know you have many choices out of which you can do with your day and your hours. So have a great rest of the day, bringing more love and grace into this wobbly world. Thank you.